Chapter 811 One Woman Man Grand Pact, Part 2. The first thing that slightly caught Xietan's attention after entering the throne room was the fact that King Philip was not sitting on his throne beyond the steps as he was the first time the two met after Xietain awoke from his comatose state. You came. King Philip's voice was dignified, his back was to Xietain and his eyes looked beyond the huge light swallower on the ceiling, straight up at the distant stars. I don't think I've said it properly yet, but I want you to know that I'm sorry for your loss. Xietain said as he noticed the aura of loneliness surrounding the man. King Philip only made a small sound but said nothing more. At least now he no longer had to pretend to be fine, when he was facing a person who was overwhelming enough as the young man behind him. There was no point in pretending to look high and firm. After about 5 minutes of total silence, the King of Gales finally turned and looked at Xietain with a slight smile that contained both appreciation and sadness. Appreciation for the young man in front of him, and sadness for the eternal departure of his loved one. Xietain, do you really have someone you love? Despite being slightly surprised by the question, Xietain didn't even have to pause to think about the answer as he replied automatically. That's right. Putting aside things like status, power, appearance. It was she who was there for me in the darkest moments of my life. She not only helped me to survive, but also gave me hope and light in the midst of so much death and darkness. I owe her enough to swear to myself to make her happy at any cost. King Philip mistakenly assumed that Xietan's strength and status were above the woman he spoke of. After all, it was hard for him to imagine a monster even more monstrous than the one before him. For you to talk that way about her and with such a gentle expression on your usually indifferent face. This girl must really be an excellent woman. Philip nodded with an understanding glance. I am. Lilith nodded as she lifted her chin and puffed out her big chest, proud of herself. She is. Xietain chuckled and nodded. Let me tell you a short story. Rather, a summary of a long story. The king said and turned to walk towards the steps leading to his throne. However, instead of walking up the steps, he sat down on the first level and gestured for Xietain to sit down. Xietain obeyed and sat a short distance as he listened to the old man's words. When I was still young, younger than you, I was not too bright and all I had was my endless desire to improve myself. Thanks to my efforts, I managed to level up rather quickly even though I couldn't fight enemies above my level like you, Liam, and many others can. One day, when I was around 17 years old, I met a 10-year-old girl when I visited the house of a noble family to pay my respects to the old master, one of the most important nobles in the kingdom. On his birthday, King Philip paused and let out a strange chuckle as his eyes looked at nothing in particular, lost in his memories. That 10-year-old girl not only surprised not only me but left the entire noble family speechless when she stopped me in the hallway and confidently said that I would one day be her husband. A 10-year-old girl wanting to marry someone about to enter adulthood? Xietain couldn't help but chuckle at the thought of such a scene occurring. Woodco. That reaction you just had was mine at that moment. I chuckled and tousled that girl's hair, taking her words as a joke that any girl of that age might make. King Philip looked at Xietain with a strange smile and said slowly, the life would surely give me a surprise 20 years later. Xietan's smile froze and King Philip continued. During a hunt for monsters that were causing trouble in one of the farthest towns west of Gales, I met a very talented mage who despite being only 30 years old was already above level 80. After being friends for a few years, I gradually fell in love with her, until a decade later I confessed my feelings. Can you guess what her words were? Xietain shook his head. King Philip laughed out loud and said with tears in his eyes, she let out a chuckle and tousled my hair. Seeing my probably dumbfounded face, she said the following words to me. You see? I told you that someday in the future you will be my husband, ha 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 ha. Xietain didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he realized what was going on and where the king wanted to go. After laughing for a few seconds, Philip patted Xietan's shoulder and said kindly, Xietain, no one knows what tomorrow holds, but don't close your heart and mind to new possibilities. If you lock yourself inside your world and the shell you created by yourself, then you will never be able to see the surroundings. Who knows, there might be better options to choose from. What I mean by this is that today you love one woman, but maybe in 50 years you will love 2 or maybe 3. You are still young, as time goes by you will understand my words better. Actually, King Philip's words made sense from many points of view. Xietain himself was a person who tried not to close his world as he did not want to miss the opportunities that life put on his sides and which he would not be able to see if he only looked ahead. Besides, it was also true that tomorrow was uncertain, let alone 100 or 200 years in the future. After all, as long as no one or nothing killed him, living at least 2 centuries was a given for the current Xietain considering the purity of his soul power. However, he still shook his head. I understand what your majesty means, but I think I speak for Ellis as well when I say that she doesn't love me at all. Child, do you think love is a simple thing that can be shaped just like that? King Philip shook his head and pointed out, there is only one way two existences can fall in love, and that is through shared experiences. It's not about time, two existences can live together for decades without developing feelings, but two existences that were only together for 1 month could fall in love if they experience enough hardships and joys together. Xietain nodded in complete agreement with King Philip's point of view. After all, the same thing had happened in his case with Lilith. She had been his guiding light in the darkness at the same time he had shown her without even realizing that not all things in life were bad and that one could always find a reason to move forward. Ellis and Seraphina inherited the skill Fate Eyes from their mother, so unless your destiny is too abnormal and powerful, Ellis' words will probably come true. King Philip said kindly. But you don't need to think about it too much, just let life take its course. Whatever is destined to be will be and we can't help it, don't you think? Xietain smiled slightly and said in a wry voice, it is funny that you say those words to me, words that I said in my room only 1 hour before. He decided not to pursue the matter of Ellis any further. Although Xietain felt some curiosity about the skill Fate Eyes, he somehow felt that the first princess of Gales was not destined to be his future wife in the unlikely event that Xietain would accept someone else besides Lilith. He decided to let life take its course as the king had just suggested. So, why don't you tell me about what you have in mind? King Philip also became serious. Xietain smiled slightly and his eyes sparkled. Slowly, he began to explain the not-so-crazy madness that had occurred to him. 30 minutes later, King Philip sitting on his throne looked at Xietain who was standing in the center of the room with a dumbfounded look on his face. You are crazy. Xietain chuckled at King Philip's affirmative, non-question. Maybe I am. He nodded with a faint smile on his face and remarked, however, it is precisely because of my craziness that I have managed to survive and make it this far. At least, I can say that my craziness turns out well most of the time. After a long silence, the king asked in a curious voice, and what happens the other times? Xietain looked away and said quietly, explosions that almost killed me and my allies. King Philip wanted to curse out loud, but all he did was stare silently at the young man meters ahead as the corner of his mouth twitched a couple of times. Xietain looked at the king and said in a serious voice, I believe you are also aware of the current situation Gales is in. Even if the parent kingdoms do nothing, the other kingdoms will not take it quietly the fact that you have captured their princes and princesses, which would have been much worse if you had killed them. I am sure that apart from the kingdoms involved with the demons, all the other kingdoms will unite to oppress Gales to the point of weakening it in order to devour it completely. King Philip closed his eyes and tiredness overwhelmed him, so he did nothing to prevent his body from relaxing on his throne. He understood perfectly well that the current situation was horrible for Gales. After a few seconds of silence and with his eyes still closed, he inquired in a low voice, how confident are you? Xietan's lips curved slightly and he said in a cold voice, as long as a 4th-order soul evolver or a 3rd-order soul evolver above level 130 with a combat capacity comparable to Liam Anworth's doesn't appear, my current self has 200% confidence. 4th order? King Philip shook his head secretly. Eventide World did not have such an existence at all. However, in that case, I'm afraid it won't be that easy. The king opened his eyes and said in a deep voice, there is a truly terrifying existence in this world that should indeed be able to be your equal in combat. Xietain narrowed his eyes and slowly said, the Demon Lord. That's right, it is the Demon Lord. The King of Gales nodded and said in a serious voice, in the past, the number of human kingdoms was 50. However, one of these kingdoms was destroyed by the demon race with the Demon Lord leading them. Even when 50 kingdom kings united it was not enough to defeat him, and they could only hold each other back as the demons slaughtered humans. Despite the slight surprise he felt in his heart, Xietain was still confident. Therefore, he said firmly, if the Demon Lord and I clash in the open field with no one around us, then victory will be mine. A single attack will be more than enough to end his life even though it will require risking mine. King Philip felt his heart move as he heard the confidence in Xietan's voice. At the same time, he was filled with awe at what he had just heard. Had it not been for the fact that he had seen how this first-order level 50 existence in front of him completely overwhelmed even a demon general, he would never have believed the crazy things Xietain had just said and probably would have called the guards to lock him in a dungeon. Still, the king had a big doubt in his heart. Why would you be willing to risk your life for Gales? I don't think you owe us that much to go to these extremes, not to mention the fact that you've already paid more than enough with the help you've given us and the 3rd order soul stone you left days ago. I am very grateful to everyone Gales, but indeed, my gratitude is not enough to make me stay in this world for months at the cost of risking returning to my world to find everything I have worked hard to build turn to ashes and the people who are important to me dead. Xietain said in a deep voice. After a moment of silence, he revealed his true goal. I will keep my word as long as you promise to give me a copy of all the formulas to make potions, copies of the blueprints to build the attack towers on the walls of Bearcrest City, information to tame mutant beasts and use them as mounts. For the next 2 to 3 minutes, Xietain opened his lion mouth and said he basically wanted everything. However, what he was offering in return was much more than what he was actually asking for. Indeed, after several minutes of silence, King Philip opened his eyes and looked at Xietain for a full minute without expression. Moments after those 60 seconds passed, a faint smile was born at the corner of his lips. I like it. Risky, but I like it. Xietain smiled back and said calmly, without risks, the rewards will be nothing but crumbs left behind by the true victors. King Philip stood up and said in a deep voice, very fair, boy. I will join you in this craziness of yours. An unattractive and rather fierce smile appeared on Xietan's face as he muttered under his breath, it's my pleasure to do business with you. Lilith, who was watching and listening to everything from the side, rolled her eyes at the sight of Xietan's smile. However, she knew that this path would be filled with blood and death, a path that would not be easy to travel even for him. Chapter 8:12 Lilith's Training. The day after Xietain and King Philip met behind closed doors in the throne room. Standing on top of the northern walls of Bearcrest City, a group of soldiers guarded the 2 princesses of the kingdom while looking up at the sky as if they were waiting for something. A few minutes later, several black silhouettes shot into the sky from the back of the castle, and in less than a minute those same black silhouettes flew over the city more than 1,000 meters above the heads of the citizens who raised their necks in astonishment at the sight of the shadows forming on the ground. Diurnal bat. The royal family really mobilized the diurnal bats. Looks like the news that some princes and princesses betrayed our human race is true after all. But, aren't those too many diurnal bats? Are there more than 40 messages to send? The citizens began to discuss with concern as they watched the creatures moving farther and farther away with each flap of their wings until they could no longer see them due to the distance and the buildings. The news of what had happened on the mountain behind the royal castle naturally could not be contained from the citizens of Gales, after all. Not only were there soldiers that day but also the relatives of the soldiers who had lost their lives in the war against the demons 3 days before. The only good thing was that no one knew that the King of Gales was planning something much bigger, or else the panic among the citizens would have already reached levels impossible to control. Although many were nervous about the future and the fear of the war that had recently occurred was still lingering, as long as there were no large-scale wars as happened 3 days ago just outside the city, they were willing to accept anything. High up on the walls, the first princess and the second princess watched as the diurnal bats began to slowly split apart as they approached the distant horizon, before finally becoming dots too small to be seen by anyone and then disappearing. Father is really planning something very big this time. Seraphina whispered with apprehension in her voice. Except for times of war, flying mounts are not mobilized in groups of dozens. But the strange thing is that there were only messengers on the backs of the bats. Ellis frowned and said with some annoyance in her voice, this morning I tried to ask Dad what was happening, but all he said was that in a few days we would all find out. I tried to talk to Xietain about it too, but when I went to his room I couldn't find him anywhere. Seraphina sighed, and as she turned to go back to the castle said softly, I guess we can only wait for now. After Seraphina left in the company of some members of the group that represented Gales in this generation's competition of kingdoms, the frown on Ella's face grew even stronger as the uneasiness in her heart began to grow, and as she looked off into the distance couldn't help but mutter in a voice that only she could hear. What are you planning, Xietain? In the forest of the ancients, deeply immersed in what was once the territory of the demon race, the blue flames had consumed all life for miles around the central area of the forest of the ancients. From demons to trees and plants, everything had been turned to ash and the ground had been scorched to the point where rocks melted and turned into glowing lava. In an area surrounded by mountains and large rocks that had only been partially melted because they were on the edge of the demons' territory, explosions had been blowing constantly for several hours. Boom, 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 boom. Although there was a short period of silence between explosions, that period of time was slowly but surely getting shorter. While it was true that occasionally a lone orc or mutant beast would appear and approach attracted by the noise, no living existence managed to survive for too long, and the pile of battered corpses strewn everywhere was proof that the perpetrator was in no mood for games. Boom! After destroying a rock over 10 meters high and half as wide, Xietain stopped and turned to look at Lilith, who was glaring at him indifferently several meters behind. Say, Lilith, is it really necessary for me to do this? Xietain asked as he looked at his weapon, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Using a whip really doesn't fit me at all, you know that, right? Going from using a heavy weapon weighing several tons to using this light string is not something easy and pleasant. To be bluntly honest, the damage of a whip is too small and doesn't suit the path I walk. He had been waving around for several hours a mutant beast hamstring after Lilith brought him to this forest as soon as they woke up. What confused Xietain the most was that she was being especially serious about it, and when he tried to explain to her that whips were not his forte, she rejected any kind of logic. This was the fourth time Xietain had told her that there was no point in continuing this kind of training. At the end of the day, for a wielder of a heavy weapon such as Xietan's greatsword, there was no logic in using whips, not to mention the fact that he was not good with whips at all. Although the super warrior skill made Xietain a fluent existence with almost every weapon in the existence, the whip was curiously one of those weapons of which the skill did not bestow dexterity or knowledge other than the basics. Lilith looked at Xietain in silence for a few seconds, and seeing that he really wasn't too enthusiastic about it, she decided to show him how blind he was being. She looked at one of the mountains over 300 meters away and said in a lazy voice, "Attack that mountain over there." With the whip? Xietain looked at her with wide eyes. Not with the whip, she shook her head and said calmly, "Use your Crimson Thunder Dragon's last words and use every point of strength you have to hit the mountain." This. Xietain looked at the 250-meter-high mountain and said in a low voice, "The mountain will be destroyed if I attack without holding back. Even if this world is more robust than Earth, my current strength is comparable to that of a level 140 or 150 soul evolver. Stop being a little girl and attack the mountain once and for all." Lilith frowned and growled under her breath. Xietain raised both hands in surrender. After taking out his greatsword from the storage ring and as he walked towards the mountain, he couldn't help but think that even women who had already reached the level of higher existences became grumpy when certain days of the month arrived. As Xietain reached the foot of the mountain, he looked back over his shoulder, and seeing Lilith nodding at him, he finally gave up. Xietain brought his greatsword behind him on the right side of his body as he stood sideways, and after clinging tightly to the hilt, the muscles in his arms swelled. With a fierce swing and low growl, the air exploded, generating loud bangs as the giant sword slammed towards the mountain. Boom! The ground shook and the mountain shattered a second after Xietain completed the swing with his weapon. Boulders of all sizes flew everywhere, and as they fell to the ground, cracked after exploding noisily. Standing in front of what was a mess of rocks with only a small elevation above his height, Xietain slowly straightened his stance, and after stabbing the tip of his greatsword into the ground, he turned to look at Lilith. "And now what?" he asked, unsure of how he should feel. Lilith said nothing in response. She picked up the mutant beast hamstring that Xietain had thrown on the ground earlier and then walked towards him. "Do you mind if I borrow your weapon for a moment?" Lilith asked as she pointed at the giant sword with crimson lightning flashes. "Sure, no problem." Xietain made a gesture of invitation quickly. As he watched her attach the hilt of the weapon to the mutant beast hamstring, Xietain couldn't help but point out with a slight frown, "Lilith, you've been behaving a bit weird since this morning. Is something wrong? Whatever it is, you can talk to me about it. While I may not be able to be of much help with your problems, I can at least try to help you find a solution." Without stopping her movements and making sure that the tip of the mutant beast hamstring was firmly attached to the hilt of the greatsword, Lilith said in a clear voice, "It's nothing like that. Rather, I realized that there was no point in trying to keep you away from some things." "Keep me away from some things?" Xietain repeated softly as he looked at her with eyes full of confusion. Lilith said nothing more, and after finishing the job she held out her right hand with the other end of the mutant beast hamstring in her palm. Her ruby eyes looked into his black eyes with clarity and said slowly, "Here." He grabbed the end of the whip by instinct, and just as he was about to ask something, Lilith explained. "See that mountain over there? Go ahead and use every point of strength to strike again, just like you did with the previous mountain, except this time I want you to use the mutant beast hamstring to spin your weapon in the sky before swinging." Xietan's expression changed upon hearing this, and he finally realized what Lilith wanted to achieve by making him use a whip. By adding not only the swinging force but also the speed as well as the height to the slashing force and the gravity of the world, the power behind Xietan's attack would be completely different from before, even though he would be using the same number of points. However, was it really possible to use this kind of attack in real combat? One time should be fine, but in a constant battle between two high-level soul evolvers with great agility? At least Xietain couldn't see how such a thing could even be possible. He did not argue and did as Lilith asked. stopping about 200 meters away from another mountain slightly taller and sturdier than the previous one. Xietain threw his great sword towards the sky and using his right arm quickly began to twist the mutant beast hamstring. Boom! 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 For every second that passed, the speed at which the mutant beast hamstring was spinning became faster and faster without the pressure of the wind, and thus, the speed at which the large sword attached to the other end was moving did not stop increasing. In just a few seconds, the sky began to rumble slightly and by the time 30 seconds had passed Xietain found himself in disbelief as he felt the earth beneath his feet tremble. Hold on until you can't stand the pressure and then strike. Xietain barely heard Lilith's words only thanks to her shouting and soon enough his expression changed as he realized that the surrounding air was being carried somewhere. However, when Xietain looked up at the sky and noticed the huge swirl of red lightning that had formed in the sky, his face turned pale. This attack. If he hit the mountain in front of him with this thing, Xietain had no doubt that the result would be absolutely and totally different from before. After a few more seconds, Xietain could not help but roar from the bottom of his heart as he felt the muscles in his arm begin to go numb and without further hesitation, he made the move to slash with a sword. Not even a fraction of a second passed when the great sword impacted against the mountain, however, Xietain felt no resistance at all unlike the previous time. Boom! He released his grip on the mutant beast's hamstring and hurriedly put his arms in an X shape in front of his face. The shockwave hit him full in the chest and even with 30% being suppressed by his Solitude's armor of infinite trials, Xietain felt some pain in his chest and his face contracted slightly as the remaining 70% pushed his body more than 200 meters backwards. Even after a full 20 seconds, the earth continued to rumble along with the sky that seemed to shake even though the cause was the mass movement of the ground and the air spreading everywhere once. Again, Lilith looked at the hell of crimson lightning that had spread everywhere along with the destruction caused by the previous attack and could not help but sigh in her heart. This was a practically completely physical attack with no magic at all. Ironically and despite being so simple, only a handful of existences in the universe would be able to handle the pressure without losing one or both of their arms. When Xietain finally opened his eyes and looked ahead, he found it hard to believe what he was seeing. The mountain from before was nowhere to be seen, there were not even small rocks on the ground to prove that it had ever existed. However, apart from a huge crater at least 4,000 meters in diameter, two other mountains that were not there before had formed in the crater with a clear cut in the center, the place where the great sword had cut through. Counting his treasures, he had used the same 1025 strength points for both attacks. But the results of both trials had been completely different. The level of destruction of this attack was very close to the activation of Xietan's most destructive skill, Crimson Blood Judgment, without boosting it with more mana than normal and without the endless blue lotus flame or the mystic pendant. Chapter 8:13 World War Outbreak. In the past, Lilith did not want Xietain to use this kind of attack. As for the reasons why she preferred to keep him away from such a style of combat even though many things would be easier if he could master it, only Lilith herself knew. However, she realized that there were things that could not be avoided. Just as Xietain had said yesterday, even if Lilith was one of the most powerful existences in the universe, she did not have the ability to fight against fate. In theory, Xietain should not know of the existence of this attack method until much later. However, due to his title Irregular and the ability to travel between worlds, as well as Princess Seraphina's invocation skill that probably played a large role in Xietan's appearance in Eventide World, things had taken a 180-degree turn that Lilith did not expect. She did not expect to meet an existence that curiously carried a great sword and at the same time wielded it using a whip in the hilt. The existence named Liam Anworth had made Lilith decide to teach Xietain the style of combat she least wanted to see, since sooner or later both of the great sword wielders would sit down and have a little chat. As Liam had said days ago, he wanted to show Xietain an interesting way to use great swords. A few minutes after regaining his composure, Xietain looked at Lilith with bright eyes and said in excitement, "This attack method is really great. Although it can't be used in a battle already started between two high-level enemies, this attack will definitely be a good war opener." However, Lilith's next words came as a great shock to him. "You say this method of attack cannot be used in combat. You're wrong. You are completely wrong." She shook her head and said with a serious expression on her face, "I know a person who after mastering the use of whips is now able to use attacks of that style continuously as if wielding a normal sword every second." "What?" Xietan's eyes widened slightly and he said, still feeling disbelief, "That's impossible. To strike like that you first need to constantly swing the whip to gather power, and that takes at least several seconds. Whether it's true or not, won't you learn it in the future once you manage to learn how to use a whip properly?" Lilith pointed out calmly. Under Zemon's dumbfounded eyes, her body swayed slightly and in an instant disappeared from his sight. Even then, her voice reached him loud and clear. If you train at least 2 or 3 hours a day, you should be able to learn enough to use slightly weaker attacks than the previous one in the not-so-distant future in real combat without having to worry too much about the power loading. Zemon remained silent for a while, processing Lilith's words and what had happened. After a few minutes, he moved forward to pick up his greatsword, more specifically, the mutant beast's sinew. Oh, well, it's not like I have anything important to do for the next few hours, he muttered under his breath. Moments later, explosions echoed through the forest and more boulders were shattered. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. During the previous 2 days, the Gale's kingdom had undergone a tremendous change. After the diurnal bats were seen departing from the capital city of the kingdom, the troops stationed in the 5 major cities and smaller towns began to mobilize in large numbers under the frightened eyes of the citizens. Not only were the energy shields meant to be activated only in times of need turned on and maintained 24 hours a day as if waiting for the attack of a great enemy without worrying at all about the consumption of soul stones, but the troops stationed at the northeastern frontier received support from at least 300,000 soul evolvers with over 50,000 tamed mutant beasts, while the troops stationed at the northwestern frontier received support from almost 400,000 men. The citizens of the kingdom believed that the demons might soon attack the bordering kingdoms, but not many hours later after midday, news that shook the entire Gale's kingdom spread like wildfire. The scouts of Weimer City, one of the 5 main cities of the kingdom and located to the north of the territory controlled by Gales, sighted an army of soul evolvers composed of at least 700,000 men advancing threateningly towards the city. When the citizens of Weimer City thought that they were about to be attacked for unknown reasons and that they would not be able to defend against so many enemies because the soldiers had been mobilized to defend the other 2 borders, the explosions provided several kilometers of distance warned the outbreak and beginning of the war. As to where the army that was fighting the 700,000 soul evolvers from the Crap Kingdom located in northern Gales had come from was unknown. However, what no one knew was that the ones fighting the army of 700,000 were actually 2 humans. Boom! After being forced back with a bleeding wound on his arm, the king of the Crap Kingdom looked at the young man in front of him with an incredulous expression on his grizzled face. "Who are you?" he asked in a deep voice in an attempt to avoid panicking as the surrounding explosions were accompanied by the cries of pain from his soldiers. Zemon's cloak flapped in the wind as his greatsword with crimson lightning crackled noisily to match the crimson lightning flashing around his body. "Just a traveler who crossed worlds," he replied indifferently, leaving the king of the Crap Kingdom even more confused than he already was. After pointing his weapon at the enemy king, Zemon declared, "Surrender to Gales and obey King Philip's arrangements, otherwise both you and your kingdom will be treated as traitors of the human race for colluding with the demon race." Jeremy Crap was the name of the king of the Crap Kingdom. Hearing the words of the young man in front of him, his whole body trembled and his roar spread throughout the battlefield. "Pure nonsense. It was you who captured not only my son the Prince Ronald but also captured all the princes and princesses by taking advantage of the fact that all of us kings had to rush back to our kingdoms days ago." 2 days earlier, King Jeremy had received the messenger from Gales who after handing over the letter sealed with the seal of the royal family of the Gales kingdom left without waiting for any reply. When King Jeremy read the message and learned that his son was being detained in Gales for treason to humanity after allying with the demons, his whole body trembled with rage not only for the fact that his son was being treated as a prisoner but also that his kingdom was being treated as treacherous when they had never committed such an act. Therefore, the king ignored the rest of the contents of the letter demanding the handover of power from the Crap Kingdom to the Gales Kingdom and directly charged southward after receiving news from his spies that the neighboring kingdoms were also mobilizing their armies. Prince Ronald together with Prince Gerard of the Thels Kingdom and all the kingdoms of the world joined forces during the ceremony to send off the soldiers and citizens who lost their lives during the war against the demons. They tried to oppress the Gales Kingdom through the power of half a dozen third-order soul evolvers belonging to the demon race. "Isn't that treason?" Zemon said with a serious expression on his face. "Bullshit." The Crap Kingdom king's eyes almost popped out of his sockets as he stared at Zemon like a rabid lion wanting nothing more than to eat his raw flesh. The only reason he had not attacked yet was because even though the other party was only a level 50 soul evolver, his skills and physical strength were terrifying to the point where after a few minutes of confrontation King Jeremy felt his arms go numb as one of the veins in his right arm burst due to the power of the other party. You're telling me that 48 of the 49 kingdoms coincidentally collaborated with the demons, but you, the Gale's kingdom which only possesses a third-order existence after the death of your queen, managed to oppress half a dozen demon race soul evolvers above level 100? Why don't you come up with something that makes a little more sense? King Jeremy Crapp's words made a lot of sense, however, he was speaking to an existence that sense could not measure. Are only two choices before you. If you had read the letter properly you would already know them, but I will take the trouble to point them out for you, your majesty. Xietain said casually. He raised the index finger of his left hand and said slowly, the first option is to surrender and accept the new arrangements of the Gale's kingdom to fight the demons and traitors. This first option will guarantee future prosperity, honors, and many resources after the demons fall. Finally, Xietain raised his middle finger next to his index finger and narrowed his eyes as he said in a cold voice, the second option is to resist and fight us. This second option will only bring misery to you and your family, as well as your soldiers. The citizens of the Crap Kingdom will be diminished to the lowest caste of humanity once the demons are defeated. A vein of anger appeared on King Jeremy's forehead and as he looked at his surroundings the urgency within his heart began to grow, because as he spoke to the young man in crimson armor, his army was facing the king of the Gale's kingdom. While King Philip's body had suffered some wounds from fighting hundreds of thousands of enemies and would probably not be able to continue fighting for more than a few hours, those wounds were all minor ones, not to mention the fact that in those few hours the losses that the Crap Kingdom would suffer would be too hard to bear. The only hope King Jeremy had was to defeat the young man in front of him and then attack the King of Gales, that way his soldiers could continue to advance towards Weimar City. Once my army breaks through the city's defenses, I refuse to believe that this old bastard Philip wants to continue playing rough. A flash of resolution shone in the eyes of the king of the Crap Kingdom as he thought of the neighboring kingdoms that were probably already fighting on the border of Gales. Rhinoceroses. King Jeremy's eyes turned red as his body grew twice its previous size. His skin took on a silver-colored metallic coating and a strange horn grew on his forehead. Sensing the abrupt increase in the other party's aura, Xietan's expression did not change much. He lowered his left hand and walked towards his enemy as he said in an indifferent voice, looks like you have chosen option number 2. I'm not surprised though. Die! Boom! 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 The explosions became increasingly fierce as Xietain and King Jeremy clashed. The ground shook, the earth split, the sky rumbled, and the soldiers relatively closer received serious injuries after being hit by the resulting shockwaves. Except for King Philip who was busy containing the enemy troops and could not worry too much about the battlefield of the two powerhouses, all the other soul evolvers could see were two flashes of light. For the first few minutes, the silver flash of light and the crimson flash of light seemed to be at the same pace. However, less than 10 minutes later, the silver flash of light began to be forced to back off more and more frequently by the crimson flash of light. His Majesty Jeremy is being forced back by a level 50 soul evolver? One of the Crap Kingdom's generals, a level 92 second-order soul evolver, muttered in shock. Everyone who was too far away from the King of Gales to attack him immediately looked at the constant clash between the level 154 King Jeremy and the level 50 enemy soul evolver with disbelief and horrified expressions. However, the reality was right before their eyes. King Philip smiled slightly and a flame of bravery grew in his eyes as he saw that Xietain indeed did not let him down. His attacks became increasingly fierce and all the soul evolvers who tried to stop him were sent flying with injuries of varying magnitudes while the more unfortunate ones were killed. Even if the King of Gales wanted to restrain himself as this army would soon join his kingdom, avoiding killing some of them was impossible considering that his body was constantly hit by magic skills and the wounds became more and more numerous and serious. Exactly 52 minutes after the battle began, the end finally arrived. Boom! With one last attack, King Jeremy's chest was hit full-on by Xietan's greatsword after the bones of his left arm finally broke and his defense surrendered to the fierce attacks. The king's armor shattered into pieces and as the lightning traveled to his already numb nerves his body was sent flying over 300 meters before finally impacting against a mountain. Rumble! Xietain rested his greatsword on his right shoulder guard, and as he watched as a part of the mountain collapsed, he muttered under his breath, without activating any of my most destructive skills I needed to fight for 1 whole hour in order to defeat a normal soul evolver above level 150. Ugh! The king of the Crap Kingdom spat out several mouthfuls of blood as he struggled to get out of the rocks covering his body. However, he had barely made it out when he fell to his knees unable to stand. Feeling a shadow rising above him, Jeremy slowly raised his head and his exhausted face contorted in pain looked up at the perfectly healthy young man who gazed at him indifferently. Xietain reached out his left hand and caught the enemy king directly by the face. His palm covered most of the king's face, and as he lifted him easily until his feet no longer touched the ground, he coldly commanded, "Surrender or die. Last opportunity." Chapter 8:14 War Flames Impossible to Extinguish. With the surrender of the king and his capture, the soldiers of the Crap Kingdom did not continue to fight in vain. They knew better than anyone that the gap with a third-order soul evolver was difficult to close with numbers, even if there were around 20 second-order soul evolvers in the army, not to mention the fact that there was an even more terrifying existence that had not only managed to defeat King Jeremy in less than 1 hour, but also managed to capture him alive. Xietain approached King Philip and noticed that his armor was fine, but there were small cracks on the surface. In addition, a thin trickle of blood was sliding from inside the armor of the left arm to the bare hand and subsequently over the body of the golden spear. "Are you okay?" "Ha ha ha." King Philip laughed nonchalantly and said with a happy smile, "These small injuries can be cured by a healer easily, they are nothing compared to the spoils of war we just obtained." Xietain looked at the spoils of war and subconsciously nodded. An army of over 700,000 men, among which there are at least 200,000 first-order soul evolvers and about a 20 who have already managed to advance to the second order. This is without mentioning the fact of all the treasures and pieces of equipment along with the territory of the Crap Kingdom and its citizens. King Philip took a deep breath before turning to look at Xietain. His emerald eyes flashed with honesty as he said in a serious voice, "Xietain, what you did today is already enough for me to be willing to give you a copy of everything you asked for earlier. Are you sure that's all you want to ask for?" What Xietain had proposed to King Philip a few days ago had been something that no one had ever thought of since the 50 established kingdoms of mankind managed to repel the demon race with the loss of just one kingdom, thus demonstrating the power of mankind united as well as the power of each individual kingdom. The wars between two kingdoms were bloody, and the clash between two third-order soul evolvers disastrous, because unless both sides were willing to throw their lives away with each attack, such clashes could last up to a whole day or two in the worst case. Moreover, because the death of a kingdom king meant the disappearance of the kingdom after the loss of its protector, no one was willing to step to the supremacy even though everyone once thought it in their hearts. However, with the appearance of an irregular monster like Xietain who should not be in this world, the bloody wars and long battles that put the kingdoms at risk could be avoided. At the end of the day, when the power of a soul evolver was too overwhelming over the other, what happened was not a clash between two sides but total crushing. "You are partying too early, Your Majesty." Xietain shook his head. He looked at the soldiers who had just surrendered and slowly said, "This is a defeated but not crushed troop. The Crap Kingdom is still capable of getting back on its feet and they only need an opportunity to do that." King Philip looked at the unwell expressions on the faces of the Crap Kingdom soldiers and could not help but nod after hearing Xietan's words. Controlling such a powerful army composed of hundreds of thousands of men was not at all easy, not to mention the fact that in the territory of the Crap Kingdom there should still be at least 200,000 soul evolvers stationed in the cities and towns destined to protect the kingdom from the mutant beasts and other races. "It's a bit embarrassing to say this, but I'm afraid I have no experience in this kind of matters," King Philip said as he rubbed his forehead, feeling an impending headache coming on. Xietain gave him a sidelong glance and couldn't help but chuckle. "Of course, Your Majesty doesn't know how to handle this kind of circumstance. After all, when you took the throne as king, Gales was already an established kingdom with many centuries of history." King Philip nodded as he sighed, "It is just as you say. Ruling over established people is far simpler than establishing a people to rule over." "Well, leave this to me for now," Xietain said. Under King Philip's surprised eyes, he walked several steps before stopping and turning around. "I almost forgot. Your Majesty, you should head to the battlefield in the west and I will head to the battlefield in the east. I will take this army with me and use it to charge directly into the neighboring kingdom while leaving the troops of Gales at the border to stop the advance of any other kingdom that wants to break through. Is that all right with you?" The King of Gales didn't even have to stop and think about it before nodding. "Of course, let's do as you say." The Gales kingdom was located to the southwest of Eventide World and there were no kingdoms that could attack from behind. Leaving aside the southeast, there were only 3 kingdoms that could attack Gales from the southwest, therefore, it was obvious which battlefield would be the fiercest and bloodiest. However, King Philip was still confused as to how he would make the troops of the Crap Kingdom listen to him. After all, surrendering and listening were two different matters. But what the King of Gales did not know was that the journey of Xietain and all the inhabitants of Earth had been countless times bloodier and harder than he could ever have imagined. Unlike Philip, who was born and raised in an established place, Xietain had to first adapt and then fight to build a small, relatively safe place for himself and his people. People learn many things about the human heart when they find themselves in a difficult situation. But a kingdom king would never be able to understand something like this. Xietain looked at the hate-filled faces of the soldiers of the crab kingdom and his eyes soon flashed with murderous intent. I want everyone to listen to me because I will not repeat myself twice. His voice rang out, and at the same time as he released his killing intent, the lonely wolf aura skill triggered. The crab kingdom soldiers froze as they saw the image of the crimson wolf appearing behind him, and their hearts grew fearful as they felt the reaper's scythe dangling above their heads. All those who do not cooperate in the war against the demons will be labeled as traitors of the human race. The families of those traitors will be treated as traitors, turned into slaves who will serve the families of the victors once mankind emerges victorious. Xietain did not shout, but his voice was clear enough that the approximately 500,000 men still on their feet could hear him loud and clear. What? Slaves? Bastard! You've all gone mad, you Gale's dogs! Don't you dare touch my family! Anger managed to overcome fear after hearing that not only would they be labeled as traitors, but even their families would suffer unimaginable consequences for something they didn't do. Unfortunately, fear could often be too overwhelming when the difference between two sides was absurdly wide. Rumble! The silhouette of the crimson wolf became much clearer as Xietain released over 80% of all his murderous intent. The surroundings seemed to be dyed crimson for a moment, and the crab kingdom soldiers felt as if their bodies had been thrown into a sea of blood and bones. Even King Philip's face changed slightly, and the way he looked at Xietain changed immensely. Not only was he surprised by how powerful his murderous intent was, but the king was also taken by surprise, as he did not expect Xietain to make threats of slavery, because in Eventide world such a thing was completely forbidden and frowned upon. Who said you can speak? Xietain said in a cold voice. A chill shone fiercely in his eyes and his voice brimmed with murderous intent as he said word for word, disobey and die. Your families will be enslaved. Obey and live, you and your loved ones will receive honor and glory. As simple as that, there is no third option for you. Not to Xietan's surprise, the anger in the soldiers' expressions was replaced by fear that was born not only from the overwhelming aura but also came from his words. One might not fear death but would definitely fear what might happen to their loved ones left behind. Demon. Only a demon would be capable of such cruelty, murmured General Lacosta belonging to the Crap Kingdom, a level 97 second order soul evolver. Xietain looked at that general whose face was pale and said with a faint smile, Demon? I have been called that many times and even received more offensive titles. But I am fine with it. After all, I am still alive and my enemies are dead. If to survive I must become a demon, then so be it. He was no saint, and Xietain knew it. He had done some things that were not ethically or morally correct. However, in the apocalypse perhaps only true gods could afford to think of the good of their fellow man, while a human like him could only bite and claw to protect his life, his interests, and the lives of those fighting alongside him. We will head east to have a chat with the king of the Xietain kingdom. If he does not agree to cooperate with the human race and still decide to continue supporting the demons, then we will have no choice but to kill as many of them as necessary to bring them to their senses. Xietan's eyes roamed the crowd and his cold voice stretched out as he calmly asked, Any objections? Several seconds passed but no one said anything, and seeing this, Xietain nodded in satisfaction. He looked at King Philip and said loudly, Your Majesty, we'll see you in Bearcrest City in a few days. Without waiting for a reply, Xietain turned in an easterly direction and ordered in a deep voice, Move. It only took one day for the news to spread throughout the kingdom. The nobles of Weimar City did not hesitate to consume soul stones to activate some long-distance communication devices, and soon the news about the defeat of the Crap Kingdom 40 kilometers north of the city was known not only by the other 4 major cities but also by the minor towns. King Jeremy Crap, a third-order soul evolver above level 150 and whose prestige was well known, had been defeated in combat by an unknown soul evolver. The 700,000-man army was stopped and defeated by King Philip alone. What? The king of the Crap Kingdom surrendered and handed over his power to our king? Are you saying that the enemy troops immediately headed east to counter the assault of the Xietain Kingdom, who mobilized its troops to attack our kingdom after Princess Ernesta was captured for collaborating with the demons? Who is the person who defeated King Jeremy? It's a high-level soul evolver we're talking about here. A kingdom king? Humph, it fits them well. How dare those scumbags from the Crap Kingdom attack us and collude with demons? Fight. Show them the strength of our kingdom. After conquering Crap, His Majesty the King will surely conquer Xietain as well. That's what happens when our former allies decide to try to stab us in the back. Did they think that our Gale's kingdom got weaker after fighting the demons? A bunch of stupids. Now you are paying the price for your ignorance. Similar conversations were taking place all over the kingdom and the taverns were full as all sorts of rumors spread everywhere. Some even said that they had heard rumors about King Philip even planning to attack the three parent kingdoms. Regardless of whether the rumors were just rumors or whether they had some legitimacy, what was certain was that the spirits and pride of the citizens of the Gales kingdom soared skyward after learning the news of how the main force of the Crap kingdom, which was always of equal power to the main force of Gales, had been crushed and subdued with no possibility of return. In Bearcrest City, Seraphina and Ellis, who stood on the balcony attached to the throne room, looked with pallid faces at the crowd of citizens who had gathered outside the castle. Long live the king! Long live the princesses! Glory to Queen Helena! Long live the royal family of Gales! Long live Gales! Kill the demons! Kill the traitors! Revenge for the death of Her Majesty the Queen! The citizens of the kingdom roared until their faces turned red as they raised their hands and gazed at the castle with adoration and reliance. What? Why? Seraphina covered her mouth and found it hard to associate these people with the warm citizens she had known all her life. All she could see in the eyes of the citizens of Gales now was fighting desire, thirst for war and revenge. She, just like Ellis, knew nothing regarding the movement of Bizeman and his father King Philip. It was not until recently when the news of what had happened in Weimar City spread that both princesses learned that without their knowledge the flames of war had already erupted. Seraphina turned to look at her older sister and nervously asked, "Why didn't Dad tell us about this?" Ellis said nothing, and as she looked at the crowd of agitated people outside the castle, she couldn't help but clench her fists with her face growing paler and paler. Regardless of whatever conversation Bizeman and King Philip had held that day in the throne room behind closed doors was definitely a secret they didn't want to spread. Now, Ellis understood the reason why both of them didn't say anything. No matter what the two men had agreed upon to carry out such a bold and fierce move, the two princesses were clear about one thing. Now that Gales had attacked using force to subdue a formerly allied kingdom and was probably in war with the Maeston kingdom now, which had also been allied under the care of the same parent kingdom, there was no turning back. The flames of war had reached the powder keg and it had exploded completely. Now they could only fight. The distance between Weimar City and Xietain City was large enough that any normal soul evolver below level 50 would need at least one full day to get there. Even a second-order soul evolver would need several hours to close that distance. Because Bizeman was leading a large army that despite all the cooperation they were giving he could not forget that they were untamed hyenas, the speed was slowed down even more. Therefore, by the time he reached Xietain City it had already been 2 days since the war between Gales and Maeston had broken out. Chapter 8:15 The Bad Situation of the Kingdom. When Bizeman approached from the rear, the troops of the Gales kingdom were surprised and went on alert at the sight of a large number of soldiers approaching. Had it not been for the representative flag of the Gales kingdom with the bare heads and crossed axes waving high, they would definitely not have been able to maintain their composure. A stout but elderly general wearing dark brown leather armor stood at the head of several soldiers and among them were several second-order soul evolvers. His name was Lazes and he was one of the oldest and most respected generals in the Gales kingdom, not only because he was a level 100 soul evolver trying to break the Third Order but also because of the number of times he saved small towns from the attack of mutated beasts and orcs was so high that probably no other soldier in the kingdom could compare to him. When the numerous troop approached, General Lazes stepped forward and his powerful voice spread over 1,000 meters, to the unknown troop, "Stop. Identify yourselves or else you will be treated as enemies." The reason why General Lazes was being so cautious was because everyone knew perfectly well that 95% of the kingdom's troops had been divided between the western border and the western border, leaving the north under the protection of the kingdom's king. Therefore, the appearance of such a large army without receiving news beforehand was naturally taken with some suspicion. Bizeman heard the words of the other party loud and clear, therefore, to avoid allied conflict, he raised his hand high. "Stop." The Crab Kingdom troops obediently following behind him stopped upon hearing his command. Bizeman did not look back and after a moment continued to advance as he identified himself in a deep voice, "I am Bizeman. Let the general in charge of leading in this battlefield come out to see me." "Bizeman? Who is that?" "I don't know." The soldiers standing next to General Lazes looked at each other in confusion and shook their heads when they heard the other party's name. For a soul evolver to demand an army general to come out to see him needed to first have the strength of a second-order existence to match said general. However, none of them had heard the name Bizeman before, not to mention the fact that such a name was clearly not native from Gales. However, when General Lazes heard the name of the other side his expression changed and under the surprised eyes of his subordinates he hurried forward to meet the new arrival. Arriving in front of Bizeman, Lazes paused for a moment to observe the young man in front of him. Despite his doubts after sensing that the other party was a level 50 soul evolver, Lazes drew his clenched right fist to the left side of his chest, making a typical Eventide world military salute. General Bai, it is a pleasure to meet you. I am General Lazes and I am the man in charge of leading the troops on the battlefield against the Xietain Kingdom. His Majesty the King has already informed all the other generals that if you appeared on the battlefield, the command was to be handed over to you if you so wished. General Lazes spoke loudly on purpose so that the men behind him would hear and know about the identity of the newcomer. Bai Zemin was pleased with this general's goodwill. He ignored the murmurs and while looking at the soldiers in the distance said in a deep voice, General Lazes, I want you to give me a summary of the current situation. We will discuss other matters later. Understood. Lazes nodded. Soon, however, his eyes moved beyond Bai Zemin and a hint of doubt flashed in his eyes as he said carefully, General Bai, forgive my boldness but may I know where these soldiers are coming from? From what I understand, the rest of the main army should be fighting in the west. It wasn't that Lazes doubted Bai Zemin, it was just that the appearance of so many unknown troops was really too unusual. Bai Zemin looked behind him and said in a serious voice, these troops are part of the main army of the defeated Crap Kingdom. Many of them were injured so they had to be sent to receive medical treatment by the mages and professionals of Weimer City while King Jeremy was taken to the dungeons with the greed bracelet sealing his mana completely. The greed bracelet was an extremely precious and difficult piece of equipment to forge. In the entire history of the Gales Kingdom, only about 8 of these bracelets could be forged which completely absorbed the wearer's mana so that activating any skill would become impossible. I see. General Lazes looked at the soldiers behind Bai Zemin in shock. He did not expect that this young man was bold enough to bring such a large enemy army to an already chaotic battlefield. Bai Zemin understood the concerns of the general in front of him, therefore, he patted his shoulder and said in a firm voice, General Lazes, you don't need to worry. These people know the consequences if they keep betraying the human race. General Lazes nodded and asked no more questions. General Bai, follow me first. Let's move to the tent to discuss further the events that have unfolded over the past 24 hours. As Bai Zemin left with General Lazes, the troops of the Crap Kingdom were dispersed and integrated with the soldiers of the Gales Kingdom. Despite not being particularly willing, the defeated soul evolvers accepted their fate at the threat of having their families under the sights of the crimson-armored demon who defeated their king so easily. Along the way, Bai Zemin noticed that there were several thousand tents built in a large area that had been cleared. The trunks of the mutated trees that the soldiers cut down were placed in front as a makeshift wall and 2 50-meter-high towers were built on top of the wooden wall. Exactly 28 hours ago, the Xietain Kingdom appeared on the border as had been foreseen by His Majesty King Philip's strategists. Because King Logan has not appeared even until now, General Pierre, who is the most powerful general of the Xietain Kingdom, and I had a brief discussion regarding what was happening. Arriving at the tent, General Lazes began to explain to Bai Zemin the current situation. With a complicated smile, he continued, of course, upon hearing that our Gales Kingdom was asking for the Xietain Kingdom's surrender and collaboration to fight the demons as well as the traitors of the human race, General Pierre did not even delay for a minute to order the troops of Xietain to advance. Once the Xietain Kingdom troops broke into the territory of Gales, the war finally broke out. For the first few hours, both myself and the enemy general let the unclassified and first-order soul evolvers clash to test the waters. However, 4 hours later one of the enemy second-order powerhouses advanced, so we had no choice but to send one of our generals in response. For the next half hour, Bai Zemin learned about the current situation from General Lazes' mouth. Because the Xietain Kingdom had sent their main army just as the Crap Kingdom had done, the troops of the Gales Kingdom were slowly being pushed back, and after only 1 day of fighting the number of soul evolvers Gales had lost outnumbered the number of enemy soul evolvers killed by 15%. Fighting against an army of 600,000 men and 20,000 tamed mutant beasts with an army of 300,000 men and 50,000 tamed mutant beasts is not easy. General Lazes smiled bitterly and said in a helpless voice, leaving aside the overwhelming numerical superiority of the other side, the number of second-order soul evolvers the enemy kingdom has overwhelms us by a ratio of almost 2 to 1 due to the fact that our kingdom had no choice but to split to fight east and west. Having to protect itself on 3 sides, the Gales Kingdom had no choice but to split into 3, not to mention the fact that it was still necessary to leave at least a few tens of thousands of soul evolvers to protect the cities and towns as well as to maintain public order. If not for the fact that Bai Zemin and King Philip had taken care of the north by themselves, Gales would definitely have fallen within 24 hours after being besieged by 3 kingdoms that were easily at equal. What about the enemy king? Bai Zemin asked after a moment of silence. The bitter smile on General Laze's face grew as he shook his head and said quietly, King Logan has yet to step forward. Although the most powerful warrior from the other side has not yet entered the battlefield, our kingdom has been forced to retreat more than 10,000 meters from the border. At this rate we will be forced to lose Xietain town within the next few hours. Xietain rubbed his chin with his right hand as he gently tapped the wooden table using his index finger. Although he was not a war genius by any stretch of the imagination, the amount of stories and books he had read in his life was so great that among them there was no lack of war stories or novels. Therefore, the knowledge and techniques from those books were naturally in his head. Something fishy is going on here, Xietain thought secretly as he noticed that there were some things that didn't fit at all. He looked at General Laze's in search of something that would give away what he had just said, but the man's expression was firm and serious, worthy of a veteran general. Under the confused and surprised eyes of General Laze's, the purple ring on one of Xietan's fingers glowed briefly and then an antique mirror with a peculiar shape appeared on his right hand. Laze's could feel great magic power from the mirror and just looking at it made him feel as if his very soul was being seen through it. General Laze's, this treasure is called Inner Heart Mirror. Its function is very simple. Every 24 hours, it lets me know when a person is telling me the truth or not. Xietain said slowly as he stared at the general sitting at the other end of the table. Although General Laze's expression showed surprise, Xietain did not take it as anything special since it was natural to feel surprised after hearing such words. What he was looking for was something else, therefore, despite knowing that the mirror would not work on General Laze's due to Xietan's level being too low, he continued with his charade. It's not that I doubt you, but since you will be my right hand on this battlefield I have no choice but to be cautious for everyone's sake. Xietain pointed the broken mirror at General Laze's and as he imbued a part of his mana the mirror released a purple radiance that partially covered his body. The general could feel that his soul was being studied, more precisely, his heart was being read. General Laze's, are you completely and totally loyal to Gales and the royal family of Gales? Xietain narrowed his eyes and focused entirely on reading the expression of the man in front of him. I, Laze's Mavis, was born and raised in the Gales kingdom. My father fought and bled for this kingdom just as my grandfather did and just as I do now. I would rather die than betray my homeland and that of my family or the brothers who fight beside me. General Laze's voice was deep and serious, his posture straight and firm as a spear while looking at the mirror without fear for the results. Xietain watched him for several seconds before retracting the mirror and looking at it as if inspecting something. After a few seconds, he nodded as if he had his answer, and as he looked at the general with a slight smile, he slowly said, It is good to know that your heart is with Gales, General. General Laze's brought his right fist to the left side of his chest in a military salute. Although Xietain noticed that the man was a little offended, he did not mind such a thing at all. General Laze's, dismiss for now and order the troops to get ready to fight. General Laze's nodded, stood up, and left. Exactly 40 minutes later and as if both sides had agreed, the troops of the Gales kingdom and the Xietain kingdom met in an open clearing right in the middle of where the camps of both kingdoms had previously stood. Chapter 8:16, Death of the Enemy Mage General Mysterious Figure. The troops of the Xietain kingdom were very confident about today's war. After practically crushing the troops of Gales the day before and taking over 10 kilometers of territory from the other side, the soul evolvers from Xietain were confident that today would be another great victory. Little punks from Gales, I hope you're ready to lose Xietain town this time. Ha 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 ha. Mounted on ash-gray mutant horses, the Xietain kingdom troops proudly marched forward while beating their shields using swords and spears. It didn't look like they were marching to war but to crush an ant. However, the Xietain kingdom's confidence was completely justified considering that they practically had twice as many soldiers and twice as many second-order soul evolvers. Not to mention the fact that King Logan had yet to make an appearance while the enemy king probably had his hands full putting out the fire elsewhere in his kingdom. Sitting on a glossy black horned tiger, a second-order mutant beast with great combat power, General Laze's took the enemy's taunts with an indifferent expression. He raised his sword and roared loudly, Charge! Speed boost! Thunderstorm! Sliding steps! Anti-wind! At the same time that all kinds of skills were activated, General Laze's had already charged first than anyone else towards the enemy side and in a jiffy crossed over 50 meters. Seeing Laze's charging fiercely on the home tiger that had left a dense cloud of dust everywhere it passed, General Pierre did not dare to be careless, and at the same time as he drew his sword, he said in a deep voice to one of the generals next to him, Jim, you take care of the home tiger as I take care of that old thing called Laze's. That damn mutant beast really gets on my nerves. The soul evolver named Jim, who was a level 83 warrior, immediately activated a series of skills that boosted his physical power and without hesitation charged forward alongside Pierre. "Lazas, it's good that you came early at the time of your funeral," Pierre roared as he activated his volcanic rage skill, and his body was surrounded by burning flames. Seeing his greatest enemy charging towards him, General Lazas jumped off the back of the horned tiger, which continued on its way to engage the other enemy powerhouse. While still in the sky, Lazas slashed downward with his sword at the same time as he shouted aloud, "Cut bright wind." Pierre snorted, and with a fierce swing of his sword, a flare of fire shot skyward to meet the enemy slash. B000000000000000000 When the bright wind blade and the blazing flames met meters over the ground, a thunderous explosion shook the earth, and as uncontrollable flames flew everywhere, the ground was covered in cracks. Not even a second had passed since the two attacks collided when the surroundings were filled with sparks and loud explosions, with shockwaves breaking out all around. The two top-level generals of both armies became entangled in a deadly melee dance that in the eyes of the others was of a standard too high for them to comprehend. The horned tiger and the enemy general named Jim also began to fight viciously. Even though the horned tiger was only a level 78 mutant beast, its superior physique and bestial capabilities allowed it to easily take on the soul evolver of the Xietain kingdom with a slight tendency to slowly suppress him. The Gales kingdom previously had only 6 second-order soul evolvers that had been mobilized to this battlefield, while the Xietain kingdom had 2 of such powerhouses. During yesterday's war, all the second-order soul evolvers of the Gales kingdom had suffered wounds of some sort after having to fight practically 2 equivalent enemies at the same time. The soul evolvers of the Xietain kingdom expected to face the same 6 enemies as yesterday. However, they were in for a big surprise when 7 second-order soul evolvers wearing shining armor appeared out of nowhere and joined the previous 6 to take numerical advantage. However, that was not all. The surprise of the generals of the Xietain kingdom reached its peak when, under everyone's disbelieving eyes, an army of at least 700,000 soul evolvers charged from a distance with ferocity that was not present yesterday. Shit, where did these bastards come from? Gales sent reinforcements? Weren't they supposed to be busy taking on the Crap kingdom in the north and the Boeotian kingdom in the west? Shouts and curses echoed everywhere as the edge of the swords met the resistance of the enemy swords or shields, while wails and cries of pain spread across the battlefield when the armor was not enough to resist the enemy attack. "Now you are not as brave as yesterday, What happened to that past fighting bravery, Xietan's bitches? This father wants to see if when the sun goes down you can laugh as you did before." As the soul evolvers of the Xietain kingdom fought with apprehension and shock in their hearts, the soul evolvers of the Gales kingdom attacked like enraged lions now that their enemies could no longer use their previous numerical advantage to oppress them. Although the soul evolvers of the Crap kingdom, who had surrendered after the defeat of their king at the hands of Xietain and being threatened with the safety of their loved ones, showed some resistance at first, they were also hot-blooded warriors. Seeing the Xietain kingdom soldiers attacking with the intention of killing them, they began to show their teeth, and less than 2 hours later they had practically become one unit with the soul evolvers of Gales. During the first hours, the difference between the two sides was not so great. Even with a second-order soul evolver over the that the Xietain kingdom had, the Gales troops did not manage to oppress the enemy, as half of their second-order powers were wounded and had not fully recovered from yesterday's war. However, after 3 hours of warfare, things changed when strangely the mages located at the back of the Xietain kingdom's army began to fall one after another. "Shit, where is it? It's an assassin. Bring it out." The warriors closest to the rear began to curse as some of them used skills like Earthquake and Stampede to shake the ground in an unsuccessful attempt to force the enemy out. The general of the Xietain kingdom's mage force, Christopher Rogers, a powerful level 93 mage, gritted his teeth at the sight of both mages and healers being slaughtered like sheep and was quick to identify the culprit as a second-order assassin. Revealing light. A pale white light shot out from Christopher Rogers' wand, and after reaching a height of 200 meters, it exploded. Particles of white light rained down from the sky and scattered everywhere thanks to the wind blowing strongly, in an instant revealing over 40 enemy assassins who were waiting for the opportunity to attack in the distance, staring at the mages with hungry expressions on their faces. Being taken by surprise, the assassins quickly retreated before hiding again after leaving the area affected by the revealing light skill. However, Christopher was not satisfied, as those were not the targets he was aiming for. "Over there. Stop him, bastard." Christopher quickly turned his head to the right and barely made it in time to see the silhouette of a person wearing blood-red plate armor zigzagging between the allied troops. The speed of the other party was so high that in less than 3 seconds he managed to evade the magic attacks aimed in his direction, and by the time Christopher wanted to pursue the enemy had left the range of revealing light and had gone back into invisibility. "You want to run? Why don't you stay here better?" Christopher's eyes were red like those of an enraged bull, and without hesitation he cast several skills on himself to improve his agility. Although Christopher knew that leaving his post like this would mean that the enemy kingdom's soldiers would feel less pressure without his fatal magic attacks raining down continuously, leaving an assassin able to so easily move in and out of the army's rear would result in the death of countless mages of the Xietain kingdom, which would eventually reflect on the overall battle. Shining Mark. Xietain had been testing the waters while practicing a somewhat different combat style than he was accustomed to using. However, just as he was about to break out of the enemy ranks, his expression changed slightly as he felt a trail of mana stick to his back, and to his surprise, he was unable to wipe it off despite trying. Looking over his shoulder and seeing the enemy general chasing, Xietain snorted in his heart and quickly began to move in strange patterns. Boom.t boom boomo. The enemy mage general's magic attack power was definitely not low. Although Xietain could kill second-order powers without any problems, taking on the magic attacks of such a powerhouse would definitely not be something to laugh at. After all, mages naturally possessed more destructive attacks compared to warriors. Large craters formed all over the place as Christopher chased after Xietain, determined to hunt him down. However, even as flames and lightning rained down from the sky, even as hundreds of earth spikes suddenly shot up from the ground, Christopher was surprised to find that the enemy's perception of danger and battle instinct was far beyond what he had anticipated. Suddenly, the expression of the major mage general of the Xietain kingdom changed when, after looking back and realizing that he had strayed too far from the main army, he finally realized the mistake he had made. Christopher was confident in hunting second-order warriors or assassins. However, this assassin for some reason gave him a bad feeling, so the thought of wanting to retreat began to grow stronger and stronger in his chest. Just then, Christopher noticed something that made his face go pale as a sheet. The mark. Christopher looked wide-eyed at the figure that continued to move away but no longer had the mark of his skill on it. 13,000 mili. Without warning, Christopher was hit in the chest by what seemed to be a giant truck. His body was sent flying backwards as his rib cage caved inward and half of his heart was crushed by the blow. After rolling several meters on the ground, he used what little strength he had left to open his eyes, and as he looked ahead he finally understood how wrong his decision to pursue the assassin of the Gale's kingdom had been. Standing next to his clone, Xietain looked at the enemy mage with an indifferent expression before looking off into the distance and narrowing his eyes. When Christopher finally closed his eyes and died, the last thing he saw was his assassin's body becoming a blur and then disappearing completely, not even bothering to take the treasures from his body or his equipment. A few seconds later, two silhouettes approached from a distance. One was wearing deep blue plate armor while the other had its body covered under a large black cloak. "Looks like one of your generals was killed just like that, Logan," said the figure in the black cloak. Its voice was hoarse, clearly faked on purpose. The warrior wearing deep blue plate armor, king of the Xietain kingdom, looked at the corpse of the mage general of his kingdom's legion of mages with a frown before looking around the vicinity as if searching for something. "Humph." King Logan snorted, and the aura of a third-order soul evolver accidentally leaked out of his body due to anger. He walked towards Christopher's body and, as if it was a piece of trash, pierced his head, casually extirpating the soul stone inside, and then dispossessed him of even the magic robe he was wearing. Without further words, the two silhouettes left quickly as if they were in a hurry with something, and soon the surroundings were almost completely silent, being the exception the explosions coming from the battlefield in the distance. Chapter 8:17 Enemy Night Raid. Using invisibility in conjunction with his equipment that strengthened the skill by an extra 15%, Xietain watched from afar as the king of the Xietain kingdom walked away along with the cloaked figure. After making sure that the two had left, he came out of his invisibility mode and sneered in a low voice. "Those two farts think they can cheat this daddy?" This daddy was sleeping with countless heavenly beauties and hunting monsters or saving worlds while they sat on their broken thrones. Swoosh! Bringing with her that delicious scent of fresh roses that Xietain loved so much, Lilith appeared standing on the same tree branch he was sitting on. She looked down at him sidelong and said in a lazy voice, "You're pretty cheeky to be just a virgin." Xietain slowly stood up on the tree branch and looked sidelong at her as he slowly said, "This senior has read at least about 400 novels in his life, some of them even counted thousands of chapters. Haven't you heard that every book is a different world? That means I've lived hundreds of lives, experienced hundreds of worlds, and slept with thousands of beauties." Lilith rolled her eyes and couldn't keep the corners of her bewitching red lips from arching upward. She really couldn't get enough of being together with Xietain because his occasional jokes always made her smile. All the women who thought he was just a serious person would probably be surprised to find out that Xietain actually also had his own sense of humor that kept things fresh in the relationship. What are you going to do now? Those guys were clearly waiting to see if they could lure you in, Lilith said after a moment of silence. If those guys were third-order soul evolvers barely above level 100, then I would have attacked them right now. Xietain muttered as he gazed into the distance with cold eyes. However, all of them are above level 150. The worst of them all is that invisible assassin who didn't come out until the end. If it wasn't for the fact that I left a spark of the endless blue lotus flame in the chest of that mage named Christopher when I hit him earlier, I wouldn't have detected the heat of a third hidden soul evolver. Well, we'll see what to do later. Swoosh, swoosh. Xietan's body and Lilith's body swayed and the two disappeared from the top of the tree. Soon, the blowing wind not only carried away the remaining scent of their presence but the surroundings were filled with the smell of blood coming from the distant battlefield. After discovering the existence of 3 third-order soul evolvers on the enemy side, Xietain no longer went out to wreak havoc among the enemy ranks to avoid attracting them and causing misfortune for all. Although Xietain did not charge through the ranks of mages again, General Christopher's fall was felt very strongly. While the army composed by the troops of Gales and Crap rejoiced in their hearts, the troops of the Maeston Kingdom grieved with gritted teeth after the loss of a powerhouse capable of pressing thousands of enemies on his own. As the hours passed, the soldiers began to tire more and more due to the continuous loss of stamina. Their attacks were no longer as fierce or sharp as before, their reflexes had atrophied, and their reaction speed plummeted. By the time the sun began to descend on the distant horizon and the blue sky turned crimson-red due to the rays of light reflecting off the blood particles floating in the air, the two armies finally showed signs of no longer being able to continue. Boom, 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 boom. Both Lazes and Pierre continued to fight despite the exhaustion they both felt. Sparks flew everywhere every time the edge of their swords clashed. The two had built with blood and ferocity their own battlefield that no one dared to step into. Suddenly, the sound of a horn sounded from the north, and upon hearing this sound Pierre immediately reacted by using a skill to push his enemy back at the same time as he stepped back to put some distance. Pierre's breathing was heavy as the blood running down his face forced him to close the eyelids of the left eye which he had lost during today's combat. He looked at his enemy with a fierce smile and said in a voice full of murderous intent, "Looks like you may live for another day, Lazes." General Lazes was also panting heavily. There were several bloody wounds on his body, the worst of them being a deep gash on the right shoulder that partially revealed the white bones under the flesh. Lazes' eyes flashed with ferocity and he was about to continue attacking when suddenly a horn sounded from the south. It was the signal to retreat coming from the main camp. The two armies retreated after receiving the order and no one attacked again. In fact, after retreating, each army sent some soldiers to bring back the corpses of their dead while respecting the enemy army and without touching the treasure orbs on the ground to prevent war from breaking out again while everyone was tired. These were two rules not only respected by humans but also by demons since many generations ago. Upon returning to camp, the soldiers received immediate medical treatment. However, what made them most excited was the fact that Xietain took out a large number of high-level recovery potions, and after diluting them a little with water, he distributed them to those who needed them the most. These kinds of potions could only be purchased using first-order soul stones at the very least, so even a first-order soul evolver enlisted in the army could not afford to buy them just for the sake of buying them. After all, to obtain a first-order soul stone one needed to first fight to the death against a first-order existence, and to achieve such a thing, a first-order soldier needed to risk their life. The soldiers of the Crap Kingdom were not treated with discrimination and also received proper medical treatment as well as potions that accelerated the recovery of their wounds and alleviated the pain they felt. Even if they did not want to admit it out loud, they all looked at Xietain with complicated eyes. They expected to be treated as cannon fodder but were actually being granted the highest treatment a soldier could hope for. Maybe, joining the Gales forces is not necessarily a bad thing. They even give us better medical treatment than in Crap. Mumbled with great difficulty an unclassified soul evolver before collapsing due to the overwhelming pain. His words floated silently among the troops of the defeated Crap Kingdom, making not only the unclassified soul evolvers but also the first and second order soul evolvers think. Inside the central tent, General Lazes was resting with a bare torso and a bandage covered with a special liquid that assisted the potions in the recovery of the body. "General Bai, today's battle was a great success. Lazes ignored the pain he felt and laughed good-naturedly as he looked at Xietain in admiration. Not only did we manage to force the enemy kingdom to retreat more than 7 kilometers north, which allowed us to regain almost all the territory we had lost the day before, but you even managed to take the life of that pest named Christopher, the most powerful mage in the Maeston kingdom. Xietain smiled slightly but did not comment on the matter. He decided not to divulge the fact that the enemy was supported by 2 third-order soul evolvers apart from the king, who was also a third-order powerhouse, to prevent the news from spreading, which would end up causing panic among the allied soldiers. After all, the presence of 3 third-order warriors could easily mean the end of the war. What Xietain needed was a little time to think about what to do and why the other side was waiting instead of attacking. There was something strange about all this, but no matter how much Xietain killed himself thinking, he couldn't find where the problem lay. As night fell, several large pots were put under fire and the smell of hot food soon spread throughout the camp. "General Bai, here is your food." One of the generals approached the central tent and put the bowl of food on the table. "Oh, thank you for that." Xietain nodded with a slight smile and dismissed the man. However, just as the man was about to leave, he remembered something and hurriedly asked, "By the way, may I know what your name is? I still don't know everyone's name around here." The general turned around and said respectfully, "My name is Xavier, I rank 15th among the generals in Gales." "I see." Xietain nodded and General Xavier left after nodding back. Xietain was about to start eating when Lilith appeared and sat in the chair next to his. "Would you like some?" Xietain offered. Lilith smiled sweetly and said in a gentle voice, "Little brother, if you want to put big sister to sleep with that and then do perverted things to me, then let me tell you that you need a much stronger poison." Xietan's eyes flashed as he heard Lilith's words, and when he looked towards the entrance the corner of his mouth turned up slightly in a grimace full of disdain. After eating to their heart's content, the troops went directly to their tents and lay down to sleep while a smaller number stood guard at key points to avoid being ambushed during the army's lowest point. A soldier from the Gales kingdom was carefully observing the surroundings at the top of the walls, occupying the highest position on the observation tower. Suddenly, his mouth was covered by a large hand belonging to a man and covered with a leather glove, then a dagger slashed his throat. The blood evaporated as soon as it began to flow out and the wound was sealed, but because the main vein had been cut, the internal bleeding and lack of blood to the brain soon became reasons for his death. After taking the lives of more than 30 soldiers located on the walls and towers, the assassin activated several skills not only from the ones he had learned but also from some treasures that enhanced his camouflage and smoothly slipped through the Gales camp. Even though several explosive magic traps had been placed around the camp, this figure moved easily while looking at a drawing in his hands and smoothly made it to the center without triggering a single trap and without alerting any soldiers. A small, practically inaudible sound came out of the invisible figure's mouth as he stared in confusion at the central tent. What seemed strange to the figure was the fact that aside from the central tent, there were no other tents around for at least 1,000 meters with the tent as the center. Despite his confusion, the figure didn't think too much about it, and with a goal as well as a plan in mind, he rushed forward, entering the center tent without making a sound. Walking a couple of steps and reaching the back of the tent, the invisible figure found the top general sleeping comfortably in his bed. Just as the figure drew his dagger, his pupils contracted to the size of needles as he realized that the person sleeping in the bed was a woman, because even if he could not see her face, the outline of her body was visible under the sheets. A shiver ran down his back as he felt a pair of eyes staring at him from the darkness, and without further hesitation, he activated one of his skills. Swoosh! A great gust of wind sent the tent flying, and the figure used the wind to his advantage to get away as fast as possible. However, he hadn't gone far when a crimson-colored dome rose from the ground, and in a matter of seconds, he found himself trapped inside some sort of giant bubble made of blood. Hey, for better or worse, you're still a third-order soul evolver. Since you came to my house uninvited, at least stay a while to entertain me. The figure knew he had been discovered, therefore, he slowly turned around while deactivating his camouflage skill. Xietain, fully equipped and with his great sword buried in the ground before him and his hands resting on the top of the hilt, looked at the figure's appearance with a bit of surprise. Interesting. It seems that there are also semi-orcs in this world. Xietan's enemy had the height and physique of an average human, but his skin was green and his eyes were large at the same time as 2 long fangs protruded from his mouth. Chapter 8:18 Powerful Enemy. The half-orc did not speak at all and his face did not show any kind of reaction to Xietan's words. Seeing that the half-orc was gazing at him with cold eyes while subtly trying to observe the surroundings, Xietain could not help but let out a chuckle. The other party's thoughts were too obvious for someone like him who had fought enemies of levels above his own practically from day one of the apocalypse back on Earth. Indeed, as Xietain chuckled lightly, the body of the half-orc assassin suddenly disappeared from its previous position, leaving a blur as a secondary image. Clang! The sound of what seemed to be the collision between two metallic objects echoed within the blood dome, followed by a burst of violent wind with the collision center as the nucleus. Ha! Xietain sneered as he raised his left hand to block the assassin's surprise attack. The dagger was parried by his forearm easily, and seeing that the dagger had fire properties he couldn't help but sneer in his heart as his fire resistance was quite good. Your strength is really low. Xietain put strength into his left arm and pushed forward without holding back. The half-orc's expression changed as his attack was blocked, but before he could do anything, his body was sent flying several meters. His feet slid across the ground, leaving 2 long strips of shattered earth as he looked at the human in front of him with a glint of astonishment flashing in his eyes. After regaining his posture, the assassin finally opened his mouth and said in a cold voice, "You really are level 50, but you can fight soul evolvers above level 150 just like the reports said." Reports? Xietain frowned slightly, but his expression soon returned to normal. He had fought third-order demons in front of many eyes. It was naturally impossible to prevent the news from soon reaching other kingdoms and other races. Even then, Xietain felt that the matter was not as simple as it seemed to be. I don't understand why a half-orc that clearly doesn't belong to the Xietain kingdom would get involved in a war between humans. However, none of that matters now. Xietain activated Crimson Flash Lightning, and at the same time as his body was surrounded by tiny crackling snakes, he said in an indifferent voice, "You have 2 choices. Submit and live, or continue your futile resistance and die." Hee. Is that so? The half-orc's lips curved into what soon became a fierce smile, giving Xietain a strange feeling of trepidation. However, just as he planned to charge forward and attack, something that left him dumbfounded forced him to halt his plan. Feeling sharp pain in his left forearm, Xietain raised his hand and his eyes flashed with disbelief as he saw from the small opening between his wrist and combat glove several strands of purple-tinged red blood slipping out. "What the hell is this all about?" he muttered in shock. His armor was completely intact, but he had still been wounded. Furthermore, worst of all, he had been infected by a strange toxin that was forcing him to consume mana to contain the spread to the rest of his body thanks to the help of his blood manipulation skill. Swoosh! The half-orc didn't give him time to think as he quickly turned into a furious gale towards Xietain, and in a second his dagger was only inches away from his neck. His movement speed was so high that reacting to his attack in such a short distance was practically impossible. Xietan's eyes flashed fiercely, and instead of dodging he used the blood that trickled down his left hand to quickly create 2 sharp arrows that with a single thought shot towards the assassin's heart and forehead. The half-orc's expression changed and he hastily used his dagger to slash twice instead of continuing his previous attack. Even if the other party wanted to risk his life, he wasn't willing to gamble his neck if it wasn't necessary. Clang! Clang! The 2 blood arrows were deflected by the assassin's merciful dexterity. However, the half-orc had no time to be happy as he felt danger impossible to avoid. Therefore, he hastily activated one of his most important life-saving skills. Boom! Xietan's fist punched the air as the assassin's body exploded in a cloud of black smoke, and the resulting force behind the punch flew over 200 meters before disappearing as if it had never existed. A bright flash of lightning glinted in Xietan's eyes as his gaze moved at lightning speed to his left at the same time as he said aloud, "Blood blades." The half-orc had just appeared 500 meters distance away when every hair on his body stood on end. Feeling the pressure of the wind cutting towards him, he quickly began to run in irregular patterns just in time as dozens of blood blades began to hit the places where his feet had been an instant before he took another step to continue dodging. Boom! 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 Dozens of blood blades shot out from the blood dome and the ground was shattered into pieces each time they hit after failing by millimeters to hit the assassin's body. However, it was impossible for him to dodge each of the attacks that were thrown at him from all directions. Therefore, more and more bloody gashes appeared on his body with each passing second. Damn it! What's the deal with this skill? The half-orc couldn't help but shout out his frustrations as this was the first time he had faced a person with a skill as troublesome as this one. Even if his injuries were only superficial, the pain and bleeding were quickly building up, so if it continued like this he would really be defeated. However, how could he, one of the most well-known existences in the entire Eventide world, allow himself to fall in the face of a small level 50 soul evolver who was unknown before the war between Gales and the demons broke out? Such a thing was unforgivable. However, to his utter frustration and dismay, it didn't matter how many times he tried as he failed to get anywhere near the human who was still staring at his forearm as if trying to understand how it was possible for the wound to be there. How dare a small human to underestimate him? He should show him the reason why everyone trembled when they heard his name or felt his presence on the battlefield. Thousand Shadows. As Xietain stared with a frown at the wound he had suffered, his expression changed slightly as he noticed the appearance of several figures around him. His surprise was evident on his face when he saw hundreds of faceless, pitch-black figures rushing towards him from all directions. Humph! Xietain snorted as he pointed his hand forward. More and more blood blades shot out from the blood dome, which surprisingly wasn't losing power or size at all, as all the blood blades were absorbed by the ground and then reintegrated into the blood that made up the dome every time an attack missed. Swoosh! 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 The blood blades slashed towards the silhouettes, and in a second not one of them was left uncut. However, Xietan's eyes widened in shock as he saw that his attacks were completely useless, as the blood blades only passed past the silhouettes as if they were air. Before Xietain could think too much about what was happening or devise a strategy, his body moved by pure instinct, and at the same time as he took a step to the left he struck fiercely backwards. Bang! Although Xietain felt his elbow hitting something, it all came to nothing as whatever he had just hit turned into a cloud of black smoke. Again, he had no time to rest and think as he immediately sensed danger from behind his back. With a move that no human being on the past earth would be able to perform even if they mastered all the martial arts in the world with expertise, Xietan's body twisted, and taking advantage of the momentum from the previous strike, he jumped up while striking with his right leg as if it was a whip. Boom! This time he knew he had hit the right target when he heard a grunt of pain, and looking forward, he saw the half-orc being sent flying backwards with his right arm raised high above his head. Die! Xietain charged forward at full speed as he waved his left hand and sent more and more blood blades towards the assassin. Just when Xietan's fist was an inch away from the assassin's head and making it explode into a pile of bloody pulp, the latter's body was replaced by one of those shadowy figures. Boom! Xietan's fist struck the nothingness and pierced through the shadow as if there was nothing but air there. A crater over 50 meters in diameter was formed as a result of the air cannon hitting the ground due to the power behind the punch. Although Xietain was only surprised for a split second, that split second was taken advantage of by the enemy that had appeared behind him. Feeling the cold edge of the enemy's dagger near his neck, all Xietain had time to do was to take half a step to the side and tilt his head down while raising his shoulders. Clang! At the same time as the sound of metal clanging against metal spread inside the dome, Xietain waved his hand back and struck fiercely without holding back at all. Bang! Again, that feeling of having hit something but at the same time having missed was transmitted from his arm to his brain and out of the corner of his eye. Xietain managed to catch a glimpse of one of the shadows surrounding him disappearing and being replaced by the half-orc, who not even a split second later disappeared and a new shadow replaced him. Ha 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 ha! Xietain laughed out loud despite the fact that he could feel a sharp pain in his right shoulder. At the same time, he was forced to expend more mana to stop the toxins struggling to spread inside his nervous system. His senses suddenly received a massive boost, and at the same time his reaction speed grew exponentially as everything around him became clearer than before. Bloodlust has reached its peak. Second activation of God of War's Will, God of War's partial possession, goes into immediate effect. Strength 800, Magic 800. Boom! Xietain stomped the ground beneath his feet and ignored the message that flashed across his retinas, shooting off like a cannonball in a specific direction with a target in mind. The half-orc had barely appeared to avoid the assault of the larger number of blood blades flying in the direction he was before, when suddenly his green face turned grim as he saw the human slamming towards him with a fierce grin on his face. Switch! He shouted in haste and out of pure instinct. Bang! Xietain ignored the shadow that had just materialized, and his eyes flashed like two lightning in the middle of the night before dashing straight in a different direction. Arriving in front of a shadow, he clenched his left fist and punched with every strength point he had without holding back his body at all. The assassin had just appeared, but the sight that greeted him made his pupils constrict to the minimum possible, and out of pure battle instinct his arms rose as he lowered his stance in an attempt to cover his chest and head. However, his green face turned pale as his gravity point broke and the weight on his shoulders suddenly became at least 20 times greater than normal. Holy shit! Gravity skill? It was the half-orc's thoughts as the enemy's punch hit him in the center of the chest. Chapter 8:19 Killing a Legend, Eventide World Trembles, Part 1. Boom! As his body flew backwards like a kite whose string had been cut, the assassin's mouth opened and a stream of fresh blood flew into the sky. He could feel how several bones of his rib cage had been crushed, and had it not been for his better physique thanks to his orc blood, he would definitely have died right there with his heart being mashed. Sensing that the human had not planned to give him even time to touch the ground as he pursued him still in full flight, and seeing the blood blades flying in his direction, the assassin was forced to grit his teeth as he released his frustration and anger with a beastly roar. Switch! Xietain stopped abruptly as he saw the assassin's body being replaced by a shadow, and his eyes quickly shifted in a direction before dashing over with crimson lightning dancing noisily around his figure. However, this time it was not so easy, as when the assassin appeared he immediately disappeared and was replaced by another shadow. Moreover, when Xietain tried to chase him, he realized that it would be hard to catch him because the other party was jumping from shadow to shadow constantly. Therefore, he stopped his steps and laughed loudly. "What's wrong? You don't jump to attack me anymore? You may be faster than me because of that strange skill of yours, but with that murderous intent of yours overflowing, it will be impossible for you to ambush me again." At the same time as Xietan's words echoed inside the blood dome, more green letters flashed in his retina announcing the evolution of a skill. Due to your increased sensitivity and efficiency in controlling killing intent to your advantage, your skill Lonely Wolf Aura evolves. Second Order Lonely Wolf Aura Level 5, Third Order Lonely Wolf Aura Level 1. Xietain naturally did not stop to inspect the evolved skill upgrade. Although the current him was considerably more arrogant than usual due to the second activation God of War's partial possession of the God of War's will skill, the enemy he faced this time was nimble and powerful enough to cause him great headaches and damage, which was proof of the purity of his soul power and his combat experience. For several seconds, both Xietain and the half-orc met in a middle ground where they both tried to find an opening in the other to attack immediately. However, it was obvious that the more time passed, the more the assassin fell at a disadvantage, as every time he jumped into a shadow he consumed mana, not to mention the fact that he needed to do something to heal the wound on his chest. Xietain narrowed his eyes as he saw the other party pulling out a red potion and drinking it. He identified it as a healing potion that served to speed up the process of tissue and stem cell recovery. After approximately 30 to 40 seconds, Xietain finally found a way to defeat the other party and without hesitation kicked the ground and rushed towards one of the shadows that was soon replaced by the half-orc. Humph. The half-orc snorted and without hesitation jumped at a new shadow. Hee hee. Xietan's lips curved upwards as he fiercely slapped the ground with his wide-open palm. Blood spikes. Bang, 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 bang. The assassin had just appeared when he sensed danger and quickly jumped into a new shadow. However, to his horror, the danger continued regardless of the shadow he jumped to, so without any other choice he activated another skill to slide across the ground and appear 20 meters far away from the shadow he had just jumped to. His face turned pale as he saw hundreds of thin blood spikes coming out of the ground, and a terrifying thought appeared in his mind when he looked at the place he was standing on and the dome of blood that kept getting stronger and stronger. Unfortunately, he had realized too late the fact that from the very beginning he had had no hope of winning after falling into the trap Xietain had prepared in advance. His green eyes met the black eyes of the human, who still kept his palm firmly pressed against the ground as he smiled coldly at him and couldn't help but sigh. Fuck its mother. I shouldn't have taken this job. Outside the blood dome, the allied soldiers had tightly encircled every exit as they watched the glowing crimson bubble that seemed to palpitate in the middle of the night as if it had a life of its own. Occasionally, the sound of explosions from inside the blood dome reached the soldiers' hearing, while the shaking of the ground did not stop even for an instant. Make sure to squeeze in with each other, General Lazes shouted as he looked at the blood dome with considerable apprehension. I don't want even a fly to get out of here today. It had been approximately 4 or 5 minutes since the combat had begun, not too long considering that 2 third-order existences were fighting to the death in a sealed place. However, those 4 or 5 minutes had felt like an eternity to the men of Gales, who knew that the person fighting an unknown enemy was none other than the highest general on the battlefield. Suddenly, the temperature began to rise, and seeing that part of the crimson bubble began to turn deep blue, Lazes hurriedly ordered the troops to move back 300 meters in an orderly fashion and without breaking the tight formation. Not long after, the two-color bubble rapidly contracted as several explosions shook the ground with such vigor that most of the unclassified soldiers fell to the ground on their butts as they stared forward in horror. By the time the two-colored bubble had shrunk enough to be barely visible to everyone, 2 figures finally emerged before the eyes of the crowd of soldiers. The first figure was naturally Xietain, who clearly had been wounded as there was some blood running down the small openings in the armor at the junction area between each limb. As for the second figure, Shadow Killer, General Lazes muttered with his eyes wide open and his face as pale as a sheet when he saw the face of the other side. Hearing the two words Shadow Killer, all the soldiers had drastic changes in their expressions. It didn't matter if it was young or old, it didn't matter if it was unclassified, first order, or second order, it didn't matter if it was a soldier from Gales or crap. They all subconsciously recoiled as the blood drained from their now deathly pale faces. However, what happened next turned some of that fear into disbelief and utter shock. Ugh! The assassin grimaced in pain, and as the black cloak around his body turned into ash, he fell onto his knees. The bloody wounds that were being covered by his now destroyed cloak that had been a rank 2 piece of equipment of the highest quality were revealed before the astonished eyes of everyone. Fist-sized bloody holes covered the entire body of Shadow Killer, not only on his arms and legs but also on his abdomen and chest. The wounds went from one side of the body to the other, therefore, it was easy to see through. The most surprising thing was that all the wounds had been burned by some kind of high-temperature fire, as there was no blood at all there. With his heart shattered, the assassin could not hold on for long before his entire body slumped forward and fell to the ground with a thud. You have received the soul power of 3rd Order Onroth level 136. You cannot absorb soul power. Xietain had not noticed the expressions on the face of the soldiers. He was thinking about how powerful his enemy had been in this instance, despite the other party's level not being particularly high when compared to the likes of King Philip or King Jeremy, who had been defeated by him before. Even though Xietain had not given his 100% and probably only gave 75 to 80% of his total, the fact that the other party forced him to even use the endless blue lotus flame was proof of how skilled and terrifying the enemy had been this time. Moreover, the power boost Xietain received in the middle of the battle when God of War's partial possession was triggered was something he did not expect, but it undoubtedly made everything easier. From that moment on, he bent down and picked up the dagger that the assassin had used during their fight, as well as the skill scroll that was formed based on a part of his soul power after his death. At the same time, Xietain managed to obtain a few more treasures that he kept in his storage ring for later study. After piercing the head of the assassin, Xietan's eyes lit up slightly as he found a hard object inside the brain, and without even taking it out he directly stored it in his storage ring. Lucky. Another 3rd Order soul stone for Daddy. As Xietain stood up and looked forward, he finally noticed the soldiers' expressions, which made him frown slightly. They all had pale faces and looked at the figure of the dead half-orc with their eyes wide open as if they were seeing the most incredible thing in the world. Before Xietain could say anything, General Lazes looked at him with wide eyes and muttered in a low but clear voice amidst the silence. General. General Bai. Why you? The semi-orc. Did you kill Shadow Killer? The expression on Xietan's face sank slightly as he said in a deep voice, General Lazes, what's the problem with your improper attitude? Have you forgotten where we are? If you have to say something, say it straight or just don't speak at all. The effect of the second activation God of War's partial possession was still on, therefore, although the effect had been weakened thanks to Xietan's various skills and titles, his current personality was different than usual. Not only was his pride higher as well as his disdain towards his enemies, but his patience was a lot lower in comparison. Lazes' eyes widened even more, if that was even possible, and he said in shock, You really don't know who the soul evolver you just killed is? Xietain frowned sharply this time, finally realizing something he had inadvertently overlooked. The assassin he had just killed was very powerful, so much so that if the King of Gales fought him he would probably lose his life. Therefore, it was naturally impossible for such an existence to be unknown to the world unless he really was some kind of monk who hid in the mountains and never came out. But seeing the expression on Xietan's face, Lazes finally realized that the person in front of him really didn't have the slightest idea who the existence he had just fought against was. And he not only came out alive but also killed it. How could a living, intelligent being not know a legendary existence such as Shadow Killer? Lazes looked at Xietain as if he was looking at some kind of unknown alien. Taking a deep breath, Lazes bowed and advanced to the corpse as he first needed to confirm something. However, when he saw the scar of an old burn on the pierced chest of the half-orc, Lazes was finally cleared of all doubt. This guy really is Shadow Killer. Lazes muttered in incredulity before looking at Xietain in a completely new light. In fact, Xietain noticed that now even the formerly recruiting soldiers of the Crap Kingdom were looking at him with fervent eyes as if he was some kind of rising celebrity or something similar. General Bai, you really don't know who this soul evolver is? Lazes asked to make sure. For God's sake, you're trying my patience, Lazes. Xietain rolled his eyes and was about to decide to ignore the whole thing, but Lazes continued speaking. It seems that you really don't know. Although it's weird that you don't know since it's recorded in the history books, let me give you a summary of the existence called Angrath, but better known throughout Eventide world as Shadow Killer. Lazes began to narrate, and the more Xietain listened, the weirder his expression became. It seemed like he had really just done something great without even looking for it. To think that such a big fish would willingly give himself into the wolf's mouth. Xietain didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but he felt happy as many things would move faster from now on, even if it meant that it would be harder for him to make a step forward later. Chapter 820 Killing a Legend, Eventide World Trembles, Part 2. The higher the level of an existence, the higher its life expectancy. This was a common knowledge fact, regardless of gender, age, or race, everyone knew it. However, there were existences, soul evolvers, who did not need to have especially high levels to live longer than their level in theory should allow. After all, the stronger the records that made up an existence's soul and the purer its soul, the greater its potential to withstand the inevitable passage of time. It was guaranteed that a level 25 soul evolver could definitely live to be 115 years old as long as it was not killed by unnatural causes. While there were some humans who could live that many years, they were only the vast minority of the population, as 99.9% would definitely not reach the age of 100. A normal level 50 soul evolver could live beyond 220 years. However, a soul evolver who had entered the second order and was level 51 could live until 300. A second-order soul evolver level 100 could live over 500 years while a third-order soul evolver level 101 could live beyond 600. Because the gap between the third order and the fourth order was extremely wide, this was where one of the biggest jumps in terms of life expectancy among lower existences occurred. A soul evolver level 199 to 200 could easily live to 1,500 years. However, as mentioned before, there were exceptions to the life expectancy rule within each power scale. These exceptions were those beings with especially pure soul power. Let's start with Angrath, then I will go on to explain the type of existence Shadow Killer was and what he represents to the world. It is known that his past was not smooth, as even in his childhood he received a lot of discrimination due to his half-orc blood. Orcs are vile creatures, and among them, there is no shortage of lustful ones. According to the history books, Angrath's mother was captured and kept in an orc cave for over 15 years, being abused in unimaginable ways during that time. When Angrath was born, his mother hated him as much as the orcs, so he was cast out of there and had to fend for himself in the woods when he was only 10 years old. One can only say that he was lucky to make it out of the deep woods alive and reach a human city. General Lazes began to narrate Angrath's life. However, reaching a human city did not mean peace for him at all. Had it not been for his especially strong physical body, Angrath would definitely have been killed due to the beatings the city guards often gave him. What they didn't know, however, was that every blow and every bruise they left on his skin, Angrath reminded each of them. By the time Angrath reached the age of 12, he had spent most of his time immersed in the forests and dangerous areas, improving his level, combat experience, battle tactics, and acquiring a number of powerful skills that were carefully chosen by him before he learned them. When Angrath returned to the first human city that had treated him so poorly, the guards recognized him, and even though they could sense the aura of a level 40 soul evolver, they simply scoffed. Lazes paused, and after a moment of silence, he said in a deep voice, "A few days later it was learned that 80% of the inhabitants in the city had been massacred, and even the second-order level 56 general who was keeping guard there had been found decapitated with his head stuck on his own spear." Xietain was not too surprised until this point. After being physically and mentally abused, Angrath naturally had his reasons to harbor hatred and seek revenge. When those who were not killed by Angrath testified that the culprit was a level 40 half-orc youth, it was hard to believe, since the difference between level 40 and level 56 was simply too great to be crossed, not to mention the fact that among the city guards were several first-order soul evolvers above level 40. However, as the years passed, many human settlements, orc settlements, and demon settlements were bathed in blood, and the culprit always turned out to be a half-orc. 200 years later, the entire Eventide world had heard the name Angrath. General Lazes looked at Xietain and could not help but ask, "General Bai, do you know how many years ago these events happened?" After a moment of silence, Xietain shook his head and stayed quiet. 800 years. General Lazes said in a serious voice, and Xietain finally showed some reaction on his indifferent face. 800 years was a long time in the past, yet, Xietain could swear that the assassin he faced recently looked to be no more than 35 years old at most. What did this mean? It meant that Angrath could easily have lived for at least 800 to 900 more years without any problems. That would give a total result of between 1600 and 1700 years. but the main point here was that Angrath was only level 136 and had a long way to go before reaching the peak of the Third Order. This pointed out how terrifyingly pure his soul power was. General Lazes continued while everyone else remained silent. Although they already knew the story of the legendary Angrath, every time they heard it they felt goosebumps rise on their skin, but as they looked at the corpse on the ground, all they felt was lingering disbelief that this legend lay lifeless before them. Let's go back 500 years from now. 500 years ago, His Majesty King Philip was still the Prince of Gales but had already been confirmed as the next king. The previous King of Gales, His Majesty Zachary, was a brave and powerful soul evolver level 178 and was considered one of the most powerful kingdom kings in the world. Despite his age, the previous king was as powerful and fierce as a lion, no one doubted his strength. After a slight pause, he sighed and continued, however, during a meeting in search of temporary peace between the 6 most powerful realm kings of the human race and the former 5 most powerful demon generals of the demon race, the former king lost his life along with 3 other realm kings and 2 of the 5 former demons general. Shadow Killer. Xietain muttered as he looked at the lifeless body lying at his feet. That's right, it was Shadow Killer who killed all of them. General Lazes nodded and said in a deep voice, no one knows how it happened, however. It is known that the former king along with the other kings and demons general teamed up to hunt down an assassin who in a surprise attack had managed to slit the throat of one of the 6 kingdom kings, who had attended the meeting. They needed to hunt him down since the search for peace between the 2 races might never be achieved otherwise, because the other humans would definitely think the demons were the culprits. Everyone knew the news, however, what no one expected was that even 1 month after the chase, the killer still hadn't been hunted down. Exactly 5 months later, it was known that all the kingdom kings and demon generals were dead. General Lazes looked at the assassin's body and said in a complex voice, most assumed that the assassin was also dead, but only 20 years later, a half-orc sneaked into the royal castle of the Anglos kingdom and after raping the queen and princess, killed them before retiring not without first castrating the king. It was then when the legend of Shadow Killer began. But his most recent achievement, 130 years ago, was what made him one of the 2 most feared existences of all. General Lazes looked at Xietain again and said slowly, according to rumors, Shadow Killer and the enraged Demon Lord fought for 2 days and 2 nights before Shadow Killer was forced to retreat with a heavy wound on his chest. The Demon Lord is known as the strongest soul evolver, so even though Shadow Killer was defeated and forced to escape, the fact that he survived to such a fight only served to boost his reputation even more. Whenever an important event occurred, everyone would say to watch your own shadow to avoid being stabbed in the back. Xietain closed his eyes after listening to the whole story and finally understood the reason why the king of Maeston Kingdom and the mysterious cloaked figure tried to see if they could lure him, after he killed the general of Maeston Kingdom's mage force. Xietain believed that if he had to face Shadow Killer and 2 other third-order soul evolvers above level 150, the victory would still be his. However, he would definitely be forced to pull out the vast majority of his hidden trump cards and would undoubtedly end up suffering serious damage during the fight. After all, Shadow Killer was a talented and powerful soul evolver who only hunted enemies above his level but whose combat power was comparable to that of a powerhouse above level 180. In fact, Xietain was sure that if it wasn't for him having sneakily hidden over 400,000 liters of blood under the ground and locked Shadow Killer in a blood dome, it would have been extremely troublesome for him to restrain the other side from fleeing if he really set his mind to it. Shadow Killer had been deprived of many of his skills by being forced to fight in a sealed place. After Xietain opened his eyes again, General Lazes said with emotion that was impossible to hide, General Bai, after this news reaches the royal family, it will definitely shake the entire kingdom. No, the entire Eventide world will tremble once it is known that a soul evolver affiliated to our Gales kingdom succeeded in defeating and slaying the legendary Shadow Killer in a 1 versus 1 battle. This is a feat that even the Demon Lord failed to do. General Lazes' voice was loud and powerful at the end of his sentence. When the soldiers surrounding the area heard this, they all began to tremble with excitement as the heat in their eyes grew as they looked at the young man in crimson armor standing a few meters in front of them. The fall of a legend and the rise of a new one. They had been meters away from a legendary combat between a being who graved his exploits in the history books and the one who managed to put an end to his legend. Legend Bai, I think this is a good time to attack the enemy. Lilith's voice woke Xietain up. Not only is the effect of your skill still active which makes you more powerful than normal, but the morale of all these soul evolvers is at its peak now. Even though you are a bit injured, that kind of damage is nothing to you, isn't it? Xietan's eyes lit up as he looked at the expressions of everyone. Just as Lilith had said a moment ago, even though he was injured and still fighting against that annoying toxin, it was no big deal for someone who had been on the brink of death many times. If Xietain didn't have blood manipulation, the story would be different, since he would have to find another way to expel the toxin, but since he had that skill it wasn't that challenging, and he was confident that he could fight against 2 third-order soul evolvers. Swoosh! His signature greatsword with crimson lightning appeared in his hand, attracting everyone's attention. Xietain pointed his weapon skyward and shouted loudly, "Get ready to attack the enemy. Since they were generous enough to pay us a nocturnal visit, then we should return them the favor."